On a cold morning in November 1997, the sale barn outside Valentine, Nebraska, smelled of wet hay, diesel smoke, and disappointment. 30 bison stood in a separate pen near the back fence, their winter coats already thickening against the coming sandhills cold. Nobody wanted them. The auctioneer had tried twice that morning. The first bid had stalled at $180 a head. The second hadn't reached $150. A few ranchers leaned on the rail and shook their heads. Too wild, they said. Too hard on fences. Too unpredictable. Beef prices were steady, and nobody in Cherry County wanted to gamble on animals that had spent most of their lives on a failed game ranch near the South Dakota line. One man kept watching without speaking. His name was Harold Beckett, 72 years old, hands like split cedar, eyes the color of Winter Creek water. He had run cattle on the same 640 acres west of Valentine since 1951, when he came home from Korea and took over his father's place. Beside him stood a younger man in a pressed canvas jacket and polished boots. Frank Donnelly, 38, vice president at Sandhills Agricultural Bank. Frank financed ranches across 3 counties and believed he understood risk better than most people understood weather. When the auctioneer announced a final attempt on the bison, Frank glanced at Harold and chuckled. "You thinking about those things?" he asked. Harold nodded once. Frank laughed louder, enough for 2 nearby ranchers to hear. "Harold, those aren't cattle. They're a fence repair bill with legs." The ranchers grinned. One of them added, "My cousin tried bison in '94, spent more time chasing them than feeding them." Harold rested his elbows on the rail. The animals stood shoulder to shoulder, steam rising from their nostrils. One old cow carried a scar across her left flank. Another bull had a broken horn worn smooth with age. "They're not cattle," Harold said quietly. "That's the point." The auctioneer called for bids again. Silence. Then Harold lifted 2 fingers. $120 a head. The auctioneer shouted. "I have 120. Do I hear 130? Nobody answered. Frank shook his head, still smiling. "You just bought yourself 30 problems." Harold didn't look at him. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I bought 30 answers." Let me tell you about Harold Beckett. He wasn't the kind of rancher who talked much at coffee shops. He didn't sit on county boards, didn't advertise, didn't own a new pickup until he was 65. But he remembered things other people forgot. He remembered his grandfather describing the sandhills before the cattle boom, when bison trails cut across the grass like rivers. He remembered the drought of 1956, when neighboring ranches overgrazed their pastures and watched the wind carry topsoil clear into Iowa. He remembered that the land had rules long before ranchers arrived, and that ignoring those rules always came with a bill eventually. The machine Harold trusted most was a 1953 John Deere 70 diesel, 60 horsepower, bought new by his father for $3,400 from a dealer in Ainsworth. The tractor still wore faded green paint and pulled a feed wagon every winter. Harold changed the oil every 100 hours, kept the injectors clean, and stored it inside a tin-sided shed that smelled of grease and old alfalfa. He often said the tractor had outlived 3 presidents, 2 droughts, and most modern equipment because it had been built to work instead of impress. That afternoon, Harold hauled the 30 bison home in 3 livestock trailers. People slowed on Highway 20 to stare. Kids counted the shaggy heads through slats. By evening, the animals stood inside a 120-acre pasture Harold had reinforced with woven wire and heavy cedar posts. Frank Donnelly drove out the next morning. He found Harold tightening a gate chain while the bison grazed in the distance. "I came to make sure you haven't lost your mind," Frank said. Harold smiled faintly. Too late for that. Lost it sometime during the Eisenhower administration. Frank looked across the pasture. "Seriously, Harold, why?" "Those animals came from a failed operation. The owner couldn't make the numbers work." Harold wiped his gloves on his coat. "The owner tried to run them like cattle. That's not the same thing as raising bison." Frank crossed his arms. "And you know the difference?" Harold pointed toward a low swale where several bison had already pawed through old grass to reach greener shoots underneath. "They know the difference," he said. Winter settled hard across northern Nebraska. Snow drifted against the fence lines. Temperatures dropped to 15 below. Harold fed less hay than his neighbors expected. The bison pushed through snow with their massive heads and found grass cattle would have missed. By February, rumors had spread through Cherry County that old Harold Beckett was either a genius or a fool. Most people voted for fool. At the feed store in Valentine, Frank heard ranchers joking about Beckett's buffalo circus. He laughed with them at first. Then he noticed something that bothered him. Harold wasn't buying nearly as much supplemental feed as nearby cattle operations. While other ranchers hauled hay daily, Harold came in only once every couple weeks for mineral blocks and diesel fuel. In March, Frank drove out again. The snow was melting into shallow ponds. The bison looked leaner but healthy. More surprising, the pasture looked different. Patches of old grass had been trampled flat. New green shoots were appearing in places that had been choked with dead vegetation for years. Frank frowned. What happened out there? Harold watched the animals move across the slope. They're doing what they were built to do. Frank opened his mouth to answer, but one of the bison suddenly stopped, lifted its head toward the far end of the pasture, and the entire herd turned as if they had heard a signal nobody else could hear. Harold walked his pasture almost every evening. He never hurried. He noticed tiny things. Purple prairie clover appearing where it hadn't grown in years. More earthworm castings after rain. Fresh bird nests tucked beneath bunch grasses. He carried an old spiral notebook in his coat pocket and wrote everything down with a dull pencil. Date, weather, grass height, animal behavior. No audience, no speeches, just observations. Frank visited often enough that spring to notice Harold's notebook filling with page after page. You writing a book? He joked. Harold smiled. No. What then? A conversation. Frank looked confused. With who? Harold pointed toward the prairie. The land. Around town, however, the jokes continued. One Saturday morning in May 1998, ranchers gathered outside the Cherry County Livestock Exchange after another cattle sale. Coffee steamed from paper cups. Pickup trucks lined Main Street. Someone spotted Harold parking his faded 1988 Ford F-250. The conversation stopped. Then one rancher nudged another. Here comes Buffalo Beckett. Several men laughed. Frank stood nearby. He should have walked away. Instead, he stayed. A younger rancher named Wade Simmons called across the lot. Harold, how's the zoo? Laughter spread. Another voice joined in. You teaching those shaggy cows to pay property taxes yet? More laughter. Then Frank smiled and added his own. Careful, boys. Harold says they're smarter than we are. The group erupted. It wasn't cruel laughter. It was confident laughter. The kind people share when their certain history is already written. Harold stopped beside his truck. He looked at every man. Not angrily, not defensively, calmly. I hope none of you ever lose your cattle, he said. The laughter faded. Because if you do, Harold continued, I hope someone gives you the same chance I'm giving these animals. Then he climbed back into his pickup and drove away. Nobody answered. Frank watched the truck disappear down Highway 20. For reasons he couldn't explain, laughing no longer felt satisfying. A few weeks later, Cherry County received nearly 4 inches of rain in 10 days. Creeks swelled. Low meadows flooded. Many ranches became muddy enough that cattle gathered around higher ground, trampling the same areas repeatedly. Harold's bison did something different. They kept moving, rarely staying in one place long enough to strip the grass. By June, the difference became impossible to ignore. Neighboring pastures showed familiar patches of overgrazed ground around water sources. Harold's pasture looked uneven, messy, some areas heavily grazed, others barely touched. Frank asked why. Harold answered with another question. Have you ever watched a painter? What? They don't cover the whole canvas at once. Frank stared across the pasture. I still don't understand. You will. That evening, Harold climbed into the old 1950 3 John Deere 70 diesel. The familiar 2-cylinder engine barked to life with its deep, unmistakable rhythm. Pop, pop, pop. The tractor wasn't fast. Never had been. Its 60-horsepower engine delivered tremendous low-speed pulling force, exactly what Harold needed for hauling mineral tubs and repairing fence. Let me tell you about torque and horsepower. People often think horsepower is everything because it's the number printed in advertisements. Horsepower tells you how much work an engine can do over time. Torque tells you how much twisting force it produces at any given moment. Old tractors like Harold's John Deere 70 developed enormous torque at low engine speeds. That meant they could keep pulling steadily without racing the engine. Modern machines often achieve higher horsepower by spinning faster, but those older cast-iron engines earned their reputation because they delivered strength slowly, consistently, and with very little strain. Much like the people who operated them, Harold shut the tractor down beside the pasture gate. The engine ticked quietly as it cooled. He leaned against the warm hood, watching the bison graze beneath the orange glow of sunset. Frank stood beside him. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Frank asked, "Do you ever worry they're going to fail?" Harold nodded. "Every day." "You don't sound worried." "I've learned something." "What?" "The land doesn't promise success. It only promises honesty." Frank thought about those words all the way home. Have you ever owned something that everyone else called worthless? Have you ever kept believing in it simply because you understood it better than anyone else did? Sometimes the hardest part isn't doing the work. It's standing quietly while everyone else laughs. July brought heat. The prairie shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Grasshoppers clicked through the bluestem. Then, without warning, the rain stopped. 1 week became 3. 3 became 6. Across Cherry County, the grass slowly lost its deep green color. By early August, ranchers began calculating hay shortages. Water tanks dropped lower each day. Frank opened loan files for emergency feed financing. Every ranch looked vulnerable, even Harold's. Then one afternoon he drove past the Beckett place and slowed his truck. The neighboring pastures had already begun turning pale brown. Harold's land was still green enough to catch his eye from the highway. He pulled onto the gravel shoulder. Something was happening. Something none of the county's experts had predicted, and as he climbed the fence for a closer look, he realized the 30 unwanted bison were no longer simply surviving the drought. They were changing the prairie itself. Frank climbed to the fence before the sun had fully cleared the eastern horizon. The prairie was silent, except for meadowlarks and the distant rumble of a freight train heading toward Alliance. He stood on the same rise where, only a year earlier, he watched 30 unwanted bison wander across Harold Beckett's pasture and wondered whether the old rancher had finally lost his judgment. Now he looked over the land and could not reconcile what he was seeing with everything he thought he knew. The neighboring ranches were the color of late summer drought. Harold's pasture still carried ribbons of green, not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough to stand out against the surrounding hills, like a memory refusing to disappear. Frank bent down and scooped a handful of soil. It felt cool. It crumbled easily between his fingers. Across the fence, on the neighboring pasture, the ground was harder and drier. He looked toward Harold. "How?" Harold didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up a dry blade of little bluestem and rolled it between his fingers. "The grass isn't surviving because of the bison," he finally said. "It's surviving because the bison never asked it to become something it wasn't." Frank looked confused. Harold smiled. Cattle like routine, bison like opportunity. The younger man stared back across the pasture. The herd wasn't grazing together. Some animals browsed along a shallow draw. Others rested on a ridge where the breeze kept insects away. Several calves chased one another through waist-high switchgrass. No single area carried the heavy pressure Frank expected. Everything kept moving. Everything kept changing. Let me tell you about those 30 bison. When Harold bought them in November 1997, they came from a bankrupt private game ranch whose owner had tried raising them inside small rotational paddocks designed for cattle. The animals had become nervous, unpredictable, and difficult to manage because they were constantly forced into patterns that conflicted with their instincts. Harold did almost the opposite. He gave them large pastures, reliable water, sturdy fences, and room to make decisions for themselves. What many people call stubbornness was simply an animal trying to behave the way evolution had prepared it to behave for thousands of years. By September, even people who had mocked Harold began driving past his ranch just to look. They rarely stopped, Pride can be a difficult passenger. But they looked. County Extension Agent Susan Whitaker visited during the second week of September. She carried a clipboard, a camera, and 20 years of range management experience. She spent nearly 4 hours walking Harold's pasture. She measured grass height, photographed wildflowers, checked stream banks, counted native plant species. Before leaving, she closed her notebook and looked at Harold. "I've seen healthier grass." Harold nodded. "So have I." She smiled. "But I haven't seen healthy recovery." That sentence stayed with Frank. Healthier recovery. Not perfect. Recovering. The difference mattered. October brought cooler mornings and the first light frost. The bison coats thickened again. The calves had grown into sturdy yearlings. Harold stood by the fence almost every evening, leaning on the same weathered cedar post his father had installed sometime around 1958. He rarely counted the animals anymore. He watched the land instead. One afternoon, Frank joined him carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Finally, Frank broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." Harold accepted the cup. "For what?" I laughed. Harold nodded gently. "Yes. I shouldn't have." "No." Frank looked down. "I thought experience made me right." Harold took a slow sip. "Experience usually helps." "Usually?" "It depends on whether you're learning from the land or expecting the land to learn from you." Frank laughed softly. Not at Harold, at himself. "I suppose the bank never taught us that." "No, the Prairie did." Their conversation was interrupted by the deep rumble of Harold's old John Deere 70. His granddaughter, Emily Beckett, 24 years old and recently graduated from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln with a degree in animal science, eased a tractor across the yard, pulling a small hay wagon. The tractor still sounded exactly as it had decades earlier. Steady, patient, reliable. Emily climbed down smiling. "Grandpa, north fence is finished." Harold nodded proudly. "You did good." Frank watched the exchange. "She's coming back?" Emily answered before Harold could. "I already did." She looked across the pasture. "This place deserves another generation." Harold didn't say anything, but Frank noticed the old rancher's eyes glisten for just a moment. That evening, the 3 of them walked the pasture together. Emily pointed toward clusters of flowering plants returning to areas that had once been nearly bare. Butterflies drifted above the blossoms. A pair of sharp-tailed grouse exploded from the grass. White-tailed deer crossed a distant ridge. Life seemed to be returning one layer at a time, not because someone forced it, because someone stopped interrupting it. Have you ever known you were right when everyone in the room said you were wrong? And if you have, did you keep arguing, or did you simply let time reveal the answer? Sometimes patience is the strongest evidence a person can offer. Over the next 3 years, Harold never expanded recklessly. Many people expected him to buy another 100 bison after the first signs of success. He refused. 30 became 34 after calves. 34 became 38. Natural growth. Nothing rushed. Nothing forced. Frank asked why. Harold smiled. "The Prairie tells me how many belong here." "Not the market?" "The market changes every Tuesday. The land changes every century." In the spring of 2002, nearly 5 years after Harold had driven home from a Valentine auction with 30 unwanted bison, researchers from the University of Nebraska visited the ranch to observe vegetation changes. They compared Harold's pastures with nearby grazing operations. Native grasses had increased. Wildflowers had returned in greater numbers. Bird activity was noticeably higher. Even small seasonal wetlands held water longer after rainfall. The visitors spent 2 full days collecting measurements. When they finished, one researcher quietly told Frank, "This ranch is becoming a living classroom." Frank smiled. 5 years earlier, he would have laughed. Now he felt proud simply to have witnessed a change. News spread beyond Cherry County. Newspapers from Lincoln called. Conservation groups requested tours. Ranchers from South Dakota, Kansas, Wyoming, and Montana stopped by to ask questions. Harold answered every one of them the same way, quietly, never claiming to have discovered a miracle, only reminding people to pay attention. Late one October afternoon, as golden light stretched across the sandhills, Frank stood beside Harold near the original pasture where it had all begun. The same cedar fence posts remained, the same rolling hills. Only the prairie looked richer, fuller, alive in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to miss. Frank looked toward the distant herd. "I used to think you bought 30 unwanted bison." Harold smiled. "And now?" Frank watched the line of calves disappear over the ridge. "I think you brought something home that the prairie had been waiting 100 years to see again." Harold never answered, because at that exact moment, a pickup truck carrying state conservation officials turned into the ranch driveway with an offer that neither man had ever imagined would arrive. The white pickup rolled slowly across the cattle guard and stopped beside Harold Beckett's weathered barn. 3 people stepped out. One represented the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. Another worked with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The third was a rangeland ecologist from the University of Nebraska. Lincoln, who had spent the previous 2 years studying Harold's pasture. Frank Donnelly recognized all 3. Harold simply nodded and invited them inside for coffee. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and black coffee. Family photographs covered one wall. A faded picture showed Harold's father standing beside the brand-new 1953 John Deere 70 diesel, smiling in front of the dealership in Ainsworth. Another showed Harold returning from Korea in 1951, still wearing his Army uniform before changing into work boots the very next morning. The visitors spread maps across the old oak table. The ecologist spoke first. "We finished comparing your ranch with neighboring operations over the last 5 years. Harold waited. "We believe your grazing system has restored native plant diversity faster than any privately managed pasture we've documented in this part of the Sandhills." Frank looked toward Harold. The old rancher simply stirred his coffee. The representative from Nebraska Game and Parks continued. "We'd like your permission to use this ranch as a demonstration site for landowners who want to learn how native grazing patterns can improve prairie health." Harold looked out the kitchen window before answering. "The 30 bison graze quietly beyond the windmill. They're not here to prove me right," he said. "They're here because this land remembers them." The room fell silent. By the spring of 2003, ranchers from across the Great Plains began visiting the Beckett Ranch. Some arrived skeptical. Some arrived curious. Most arrived carrying years of assumptions. Harold welcomed every one of them. He never delivered speeches. Instead, he walked, slowly, across the prairie. He would stop beside a patch of native switchgrass or kneel beside fresh buffalo wallows filled with rainwater where frogs and insects now lived. Then he would ask visitors a simple question. "What do you notice?" People usually answered with numbers. Grass height, rainfall, stocking rates. Harold smiled politely. Then he pointed toward meadowlarks, monarch butterflies, prairie clover, or the deep roots holding loose sand in place. Eventually, they began noticing those things first. Frank became one of Harold's strongest supporters. At Sandhills Agricultural Bank, he started encouraging ranchers to think beyond immediate production and consider long-term land health when planning improvements. The younger loan officers were surprised. Frank often told them about the day he laughed at Harold in front of everyone outside the livestock exchange. "I wasn't laughing because he was foolish," he admitted. "I was laughing because I'd mistaken something unfamiliar for something impossible." Those words spread almost as quickly as Harold's story. "Let me tell you about redemption. People sometimes imagine redemption arrives with dramatic apologies or grand public gestures. More often, it happens quietly. It begins the moment someone becomes willing to replace certainty with curiosity." Frank never erased the laughter from that spring morning in 1998. He couldn't. Instead, he chose to make sure the lesson outlasted the mistake. That is how respect grows, not by pretending we were always right, but by admitting when someone else saw farther than we did. Emily Beckett gradually assumed more responsibility for the ranch. She blended her university training with the patient wisdom she had learned from her grandfather. She used modern range monitoring tools, satellite imagery, and soil testing. Harold encouraged every improvement. He had never believed old automatically meant better, only that new ideas should first prove their respect to the land. The old John Deere 70 remained part of daily life. Every winter it still hauled hay. Every spring it still pulled fence posts. Visitors often asked why Harold never replaced it. He would rest one hand on the faded green hood, because it still finishes every job I ask of it. By 2007, exactly 10 years after Harold bought the 30 unwanted bison at the Valentine auction, the ranch looked different from the day those trailers first rolled through the gate. Native grasses covered hills once showing patches of exposed sand. Seasonal wetlands supported more waterfowl. Bobwhite quail, seldom seen their years earlier, appeared again. The prairie wasn't frozen in time. It was alive, changing, recovering. One autumn afternoon, Harold stood beside Frank, overlooking the original pasture. Both men had grown older. Frank's hair had turned gray around the temples. Harold leaned a little more heavily on the fence. The bison moved across the hills exactly as they always had, without hurry, without instruction. Frank smiled. "You know, I still remember saying you bought 30 problems." Harold chuckled. "You weren't completely wrong." Frank laughed. "No, they were 30 problems." He paused. "They just weren't my problems." The two men watched the herd disappear beyond a rise. Neither felt the need to fill the silence. In January 2010, after nearly 6 decades of caring for the same Nebraska ranch, Harold Beckett passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 84. The funeral filled the small church outside Valentine. Neighbors came. Bankers came. Biologists came. Young ranchers came. Many had never met Harold until after the bison story spread. Yet every one of them carried home the same memory. A quiet man who never argued louder than the prairie itself. Emily inherited the ranch exactly as Harold had hoped. She kept the herd together, never chasing rapid expansion, never sacrificing the land for a quick profit. Children visiting school field trips learned why bison rolled in the dust, why native grasses grew so deep, and why healthy land required patience more than perfection. The original 30 were long gone, but their descendants still crossed the same hills where nobody had wanted them. The old John Deere 70 still started every feeding season, its familiar 2-cylinder rhythm echoing across the yard, like a voice refusing to be forgotten. Visitors often asked Emily what made her grandfather different. She always smiled before answering. He listened more than he talked. 5 years had changed more than a landscape. They had changed minds. A banker learned that wisdom isn't measured by confidence. Neighbors learned that laughter is sometimes only ignorance speaking too soon. A forgotten herd reminded an entire region that the oldest solutions are not always the simplest, but they are often the ones nature has been practicing the longest. Some landscapes aren't transformed by forcing them to become something new. They heal when we remember what they were always meant to be. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly believed in an idea long before anyone else did, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Maybe it was a farmer, a rancher, a parent, or a neighbor who saw value where everyone else saw failure. I read every story because they're part of preserving the lessons that built rural America. And if you'd like to hear about the Wyoming rancher who rescued a forgotten herd of wild Mustangs that everyone said could never be worked, and what they accomplished together, you'll want to join me for the next story.